Okay, but what happens when that classed position of kings and queens, the pearly kings and queens, becomes absorbed into the cultural dominant, which is a model representing the newest fashion for a local fashion house, showing this as something that is a consumable product? What happens to working class culture when it's absorbed into the dominant? What happens when graffiti art, which was once an oppositional art practice against various oppositional groups in New York City, is taken up by the museum industry and then perpetrates the Ponzi scheme, which we know to be the art world in disguise? I'm sure that Chris enjoys that. I hope you do. Okay, so it's apparent from this notion of an individual class subject and this notion of symbolic capital as being traded back and forth, and the contingent nature of the shifting boundaries of class and class's ideology, that we begin to think of the shifting character of our project, our leftist project, which is to engage a class project which is one that is emancipatory and perhaps leading towards social and cultural change. It's apparent from this very, very brief discussion of ideology, and I spent a lot of time explaining this in terms of the work of Carl Beveridge and Carol Conde, and I'm not showing my own work practice here, which I shamelessly could, to illustrate some aspects of my own struggle with class consciousness. And I must say the first question that I asked Carol and Carl was, shamelessly, I asked them, what class do you represent? What class do you come from? Because I know they both, from drinking with them over the years, that they come from middle class backgrounds, upwardly mobile middle class backgrounds. Some of you may come from those very backgrounds. I come from also an upwardly mobile middle class aspiring background from a mining community in Scotland, which emigrated to New Zealand with my grandfather and grandmother, who were atheists and members of the Communist Party. And my mother was a defender of Presbyterianism, but also a socialist feminist before the very term was. So I grew up as what some of my friends understand to be a red diaper kid. But yes, but then So I'll just finish up here. The more comprehensive sets of class indicators, either within cultural representation or within various forms of organized activist groups that engage with the power dynamics that exist, whether they be union-based or autonomous organizations such as Platypus, or artist unions that seek out the rights of the subordinate, the disenfranchised, and the alienated. We have to clarify, in my terms, the sets of class indicators that establish our identities and enable us to move towards what Habermas called a Bindungseffekt, a binding effect, which could lead to social engagement and the dynamics of discussion that can enable us to realize opportunities for critical education and hopefully emancipation. Thank you. A little bit of time, I think.
That's okay, Sebastien.
Sure.
Good to go? Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. My presentation, I'll start off speaking of art and artists and fairly quickly veer towards organizing, political organizing, because I think the questions are posed, where we're asking what the role of artists are in revolutionary organizing. So necessarily the work of artists will depend on what that political project actually is. So that's kind of where I'll be going towards. So first off, have artists speaking to or on behalf of a working class and its cultural sensibilities been a necessary part of revolutionary organizing? In my opinion, without a doubt, yes. A political project necessarily needs to be communicated, and since an artist's fundamental purpose is to communicate through various methods of narration and through the creation of symbols, artists are in fact important motors for the advancement of political ideas and projects. Also, collectively, artists weave and sustain a cultural fabric that hosts and channels sets of ideas and values, which, aggregated, collected together, represent our collective human imagination. So, put together, all the works of all the artists form a tapestry of our collective imagination as human beings. So where artists play an important role in revolutionary struggle is in challenging the limits of our imagination. In other words, challenging our ideology, our way of thinking of the world, and stretching it into new horizons of possibilities, new ways of thinking. In Marxist terms, revolutionary artists engage in hegemonic battles. That is, battles of ideological dominance, making certain ideas and meanings dominant, not forced, but accepted as norms as they become accepted and understood as common sense. So these battles are waged over the signifying concepts we use to make sense of our world, like justice, democracy, and humanity. Artists can depict in material form and communicate the ideas of what these things mean to us in oppositional and subversive ways that stretch our ideological limits. So the common understandings of justice and democracy as ideas are shaped and limited by the way they're currently materialized in our social structures. But artists and political organizers generally can make us imagine new meanings beyond what we see and take for granted, and redefine what the new common understanding of these concepts can be. So in organizing or populist terms, artists can raise our expectations in creative ways about what these things mean, and compel us to confront and change the conditions that keep us from meeting those new expectations. Back to the topic of working class culture. Within a past political project that positioned working class as the driving force of revolutionary struggle, it was without question necessary to have people committed to materialize and communicate the imaginary field put forward by this political project, both to the working class itself in order to raise their own consciousness about their condition and role, and also beyond it in order to generalize the acceptance of this worldview and place it in cultural dominance. That is, make it the new normalized common sense of how we imagine ourselves and what we should expect of our social world. So again, to me, the answer to the question of whether or not artists are still needed or necessary in revolutionary organizing is obviously yes. However, the answer to whether or not artists are still needed to formulate and depict a working class culture is, well, that depends. That depends on how we would define and therefore depict a working class today. It depends on whether artists are responsive to the changes in our social understanding of work, class, and revolution, or whether they're simply nostalgically repeating the same romanticized cliches and stereotypes of past depictions of a working class. And here I'm referring to the quintessential images of white men in overalls working in manufacturing or extractive industries. And just like this panel of 3 white men is not representative of working peoples or of revolution, it isn't now, and it never has been. So artists, like revolutionary organizers generally, need to recognize that and change those habits. Working people are also female, queer, of color, indigenous, and of differing abilities. The Khyber Center for the Arts recently hosted a fantastic exhibit curated by Robin Metcalf titled Out, Queer Looking, Queer Acting Revisited. The show was a remounted and updated retrospective of queer activism through the artistic materials produced during those decades of struggle in Halifax. This is working class culture, despite the fact that there were no miners, fishermen, auto plants, banjos, or red flags depicted in this expo. The working class was certainly depicted, and it was most certainly revolutionary. If we take the Occupy slogan as a general measure, the 99% versus the 1%, then roughly 99% of the people represented in that exhibit are working class. We also need to recognize that among miners, fishermen, and assembly line workers, there were and are queer people, people of color, and people of differing abilities, even though 20th century depictions of the working class suggested otherwise. At Mayworks Halifax, a union-sponsored arts festival of which I'm an organizer, we make very conscious efforts in our programming to challenge working-class stereotypes and offer a program of events that is much more reflective of who workers are and what are workplace issues. For example, a few years ago, we programmed a play that examined mental health and the services in place for people suffering from mental illness. And at the time, in response to our choice of programming, some people asked, well, what does that have to do with unions? As though no one who goes to work or belongs to a union suffers from mental illness. Most of us spend huge amounts of time in our lives at work, if not most of it. So for someone who doesn't benefit from white, male, cis, or able-bodied privilege, a lot of the racist, sexist, transphobic, and ableist bullshit they have to deal with comes up at work. So unions need to take those issues very seriously, and artists formulating a working-class culture need to include those struggles within their own work. So considering all that, and because we're discussing the role of art within an organizing strategy, to me the more important questions to answer pertain to organizing, and I am an organizer. What should artists depict in a revolutionary struggle today depends on who we should be reaching out to and organizing, and under what unifying commonalities. Since the 60s and 70s, the notion of a working class revolution has largely been abandoned, and this, in my opinion, is due to two main factors. The first factor is postmodernism's overthrow of the working class identity as being the exclusive driver of revolutionary change, and the relegation of class as just another point of oppression alongside race, gender, ability, and others. Postmodernism called into question the certainty of the social theories of modernism that claimed to be one-size-fits-all, the universal answer for social progress and emancipation for all humanity. Beginning in the 60s, the social movements of the time were attacked for washing over any other type of oppression under the banner of class, and of sweeping under the rug the white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity left unchallenged within the movements themselves and elsewhere. The excuse given from within those movements was that class came first in order to trigger a revolution. The other considerations came later, if they were even recognized at all. Of course, a deep distrust of those movements and the associated working class culture then followed. The second factor in the abandonment of a working class revolution, in my opinion, is that there's been a steep decline in the intuitive recognition of a working class at all. Most people who should identify as working class simply don't anymore. Instead, they increasingly identify as a middle class. The concept of a working class today has been really heavily diluted inside a liberal reframing of class that ignores the dynamics of ownership and control and instead focuses on a scale of income accumulation, lower, middle, upper, and an associated level of consumption as a gauge of personal accomplishment. So in other words, the lines of class identification now are much less drawn along distinction of who owns the things and places needed to produce, but rather how much money we have available to spend individually. This shift in class consciousness is due, I think, to the neoliberal shaping of our economy and the impact that has had on our social relationships. Neoliberalism is both a high-intensity form of capitalism, free from government interference, except, of course, where government force is used in its defense, and its accompanying form of liberal values, hyper-individualism and self-reliance. These have emerged in the late 70s and dominated the global economy and its core countries ever since. The factory floors and places of daily contact and long-term bonding and organizing have largely disappeared in these countries, including our own. Now workers are increasingly scattered across small work sites for short amounts of time, isolated in cubicles, or fending for themselves as freelancers. These material conditions are paired with the reinvigorated ideology of the American dream, where anybody can achieve material wealth through individual merit, and inversely, where anyone who fails to achieve material wealth only have themselves to blame. In this frame of thought, the left-wing analysis of social problems due to internal social friction, like class war, patriarchy, or white supremacy, is obscured, and replaced instead by a right-wing social analysis blaming the disruption of a unified community by perceived external threats, like immigrants, blacks, or gays. While all this has led to a wide abandonment of revolution as a working-class phenomenon, it certainly doesn't mean that a revolution is no longer needed or that capitalism should be left off the hook. I would contend that class is not the universal point around which revolution will unfold. Class is still key for radical change beyond capitalism, but it needs to be reimagined in a way where it can stand for a common struggle without being imposed as the common struggle. In my opinion, class needs to be reimagined as part of a stream of struggles, each pushing each other forward, if and when seen as part of a common fight. Of course, class oppression is the most direct point of oppression generated by capitalism. Capitalism being an economic system and class oppression being economic oppression. But that doesn't mean that it's the most acute point of oppression for anyone in any context. Often, marginalized communities will struggle for inclusion into the current social structures from which they are marginalized, which to an anti-capitalist will seem reformist. For example, gay rights in the military or access to management jobs for women and people of color. However, to deny the legitimacy of those struggles because they are not perceived as radical is to deny the privilege of straight or white men conferred by white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. White or male or straight activists have the choice of whether or not to struggle against racism, sexism, and homophobia. People of color, women, queer folk, of course, don't have that choice. Those struggles are imposed onto them. So those of us in positions of privilege have a responsibility to support those struggles against our very own privilege, but also to open up spaces, still in consideration of our privilege, to talk about anti-racist or queer struggles as also class struggles and vice versa. Capitalism is the motor of most of our present-day global society, and as such, the driving engine of economic oppression and of hyper-marginalization along many other points of oppression. Because of this, capitalism must be a focal point of struggle in revolutionary politics. Leaving it unaddressed will make any struggle unable to effect radical change that pulls out the problem at the roots, rather than simply alleviate it somehow or somewhat. Because many social sectors and identities are threatened by the logic of capitalism, the notion of class struggle alone is totally insufficient to define the identity of those involved in anti-capitalist struggle. Here I'm speaking, of course, as an anti-capitalist myself. And in that analysis, I also need to consider that working class struggles also are more often than not reformist, demanding immediate but concrete ameliorations in working conditions. And so the necessity to open up the space for radical understandings of capitalism's role in economic class oppression applies here too. Just because surplus value or profits are extracted from workers will not mean that they will automatically resist this. So since the antagonism against capitalism is not internal to the dynamics of production and labor, that attitude of antagonism towards capitalism depends on how the identity of workers is constructed. That's why there's nothing inherently anti-capitalist in struggles of the trade union movement. So for all those reasons, I believe that a people's revolution, more so than a working class revolution, is what we should be formulating, depicting, and organizing. In this project, I see the role of artists as developing creative methods to accomplish the following tasks. 1, pointing out the contradiction in the dominant neoliberal ideology. In other words, the gap between the promise and the fact. 2, examining not only the objective dynamics of exploitation and resistance, but also the subjective dynamics of identification through the negotiation of particular and universal interests between various social groupings. And thirdly, finally, challenging the argument that thinking about radical change necessarily leads to gulags, which is the argument through which the existing order defends itself successfully, even though exploitation and corruption is rampant under capitalism. That's it. Thank you.
All right, I'll be reading from my paper too. It should be around 15 minutes or so and refers to this one image we have up here.
Go ahead.
An internet meme of an alleged poster from the McCarthy era has been circulating widely in the blogosphere recently. The poster reads, quote, "Beware of artists. They mix with all classes of society and are therefore most dangerous," end quote. But But like most content produced by blogging culture, the image of the poster is totally fabricated, fictionalizing our online historical archive. The statement from the meme is actually a truncated passage from an 1845 letter written by Leopold I, the first king of the Belgians, to Queen Victoria, Queen of the United Kingdom. In the letter, Leopold I warns against engaging with artists since, he claimed, quote, "They are acquainted with all classes of society, and for that very reason dangerous. They are hardly ever satisfied, and when you have too much to do with them, you're sure to have des ennuis." And des ennuis is usually defined as boredom, but it also meant trouble as like a secondary definition. It makes sense that Leopold I viewed artists as a threat to the status quo and his political power. The creation and experience of artworks deals with controversial subjects, challenges official culture, and brings to surface complex emotions that are often suppressed. Moreover, the failed 1848 revolutions that shook Europe during Leopold I's rule were in large part led and organized by artists themselves: Courbet, Corot, Daumier, Manet, and many others. The activities induced by artists are hardly recipes for stability. Their role in forging transformations in cultural and social life resonates with all people from all credos and classes, since each group participates in the same totalizing society, that of capitalism. Artists made the wrong state of things visceral and intelligible to the masses by giving form to the tensions developing between classes during the mid-19th century. Artists at the time were the unassimilated class that tantalized all classes into imagining a harmonious and classless society. They were the déclassé of bourgeois society in crisis. Despite the internet meme's patent historical falsehood, a kernel of truth can be extracted from the sentiment it conveys, however obtusely it presents itself. For instance, Senator McCarthy and his cabal considered artists to be dangerous subversives and sought to persecute them along with the communists for un-American activities. These motives are not so different from Leopold I's distrust in artists. Yet, the deeper truth about the meme is what it can tell us about the present, about the climate of our current cultural and socio-political conditions. The Appleseite question to ask is, why create a meme that conflates these moments of history, and why do it now? It is my hunch that raising the anxieties about artists and their relationship to class is due to these two entities' current absence, or more precisely, their vacancy. Art has become a recycling center for pastiche and pre-digested creations, while membership and working-class organizations are at a historic low. Both are now politically ineffective at fighting for greater social freedoms, whether it be in the realm of widening our experience and sensibilities, or loosening the grip of exploitative and dominating practices in labor relations. The meme thus acts as a wish image that idealizes a time when art and class were sites of contestation and in social antagonisms. This moment has since passed, and it is questionable if artists can even be considered dangerous agents who help propel whatever remains of the class struggle today. With the absence of a substantial left that tasks workers' movements to heighten the problems and contradictions of bourgeois society towards a socialist future, even the most subversive gestures performed by artists lose their potency. The artist's status as the once assimilated class, the déclassé, has been indiscriminately swallowed up by the ruling class like undissolved sugar in an iced latte. The fact that the meme actually does exist shows that all is not lost, that art and the workers' movement's deflation in political significance was not an inevitable course. This scintilla of thought is still in our social and historical consciousness, that art and class, through their own inner structures, can possess emancipatory attributes. But given that art and class are so politically weak today, it is evident that there is a wide gap between theory and practice, thought and action, means and ends, how to get from here to there. If the left is to attempt to realize the desire to make art and class matter again, which should be wholly supported, then a good place to begin is asking how this can be done, and which methods can be used to achieve such an ambitious goal. History is the natural entry point in seeking answers to these questions. Since 1848, there has been a multitude of approaches which seek to endow art and culture with political significance for the class struggle. According to Marx and Engels, 1848 was a revealing year for the left, since it became apparent that the proletariat needed to organize itself autonomously in the fight for socialism, as a class in itself and for itself. At first thought, then, it seems reasonable to assume that a separate working-class culture should emerge out of the same necessity, becoming easily distinguishable from bourgeois culture and all its permutations. But it was not until the early 20th century, when a proletarian party obtained state power and the Soviet Union was established, that the relationship between advancing both culture and the workers' movement entered into an acute crisis. It became clearer that the development of culture, to a large degree, operated in its own domain and did not mechanically reflect the same problems facing left politics. Generally speaking, two opposing camps formed in the 1920s over the question of the relationship between the revolutionary workers' movement and culture. They can be summarized as follows. There was the Second International Radicals, exemplified in figures like Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, who saw critical possibilities in the highest forms of bourgeois art and culture, and hoped that expanding educational opportunities for the masses would allow all the best elements of bourgeois society to flourish, ergo aiding their revolutionary struggle. Bourgeois society was indeed the first civilization in history which offered the prospects of a universal culture, but was thwarted by the logic of capital. Only when the permanent global revolution takes place can an emancipated, authentic socialist culture dialectically arise from the seeds of the old bourgeois culture. On the other end, figures like Bogdanov, Lunarsky, right? Is that right? And Gorky supported a program called the Prolekult, also known as the proletarian culture, that was meant to be an autonomous organization incubating a prefigurative socialist culture. The Prolekult supposedly assisted the working class in shedding off the dead skin of all bourgeois culture, which they saw as inherently oppressive, outmoded, and a dead end for revolutionary politics. Here, bourgeois society in total was looked upon with utter distrust as an unmediated expression of the ruling class that could only serve their own interests. Unlike the Second International Radicals, proponents of the Prolekult saw nothing worth redeeming in the fruits that bourgeois culture bore. Establishing an independent working class culture thus meant not an emergence from bourgeois society, but a clean break from it. It cannot be denied that the proponents of an independent working class culture, or the Prolekult, offered salient criticisms of the problems affecting cultural life in bourgeois society. Yet, the Second International Radicals rightly criticized the notion of the independent working class culture as a flat-footed response to the stunted development of culture and art in capitalist society. It would be wholly counterproductive to fully develop culture based on the working class, since the working class is meant to be the intermediary to abolish all classes. As Trotsky aptly put it, and I quote, "It is fundamentally incorrect to contrast bourgeois culture and bourgeois art with proletarian culture and proletarian art. The latter will never exist because the proletarian regime is temporary and transient. The historical significance and moral grandeur of the proletarian revolution consist in the fact that it is laying the foundations of a culture which is above all classes and which will be the first culture that is truly human." End quote. The means towards a proletarian revolution is simultaneously the abolition and completion of bourgeois society by realizing a promise it could never make good on under capitalist relations. The task of the proletariat is to safeguard the advanced and progressive facets of bourgeois culture from the ruling class's reactionary vandalism against it after the mid-19th century. Hence, there can never be a clean break from capitalist society. Bourgeois culture is not one-dimensionally oppressive and reactionary, as many of the figures of the Prolekult painted it. It is at once liberating and dominating, and this contradictory circumstance is expressed no better than in bourgeois cultural productions in art. Even if art was decadent in the 20th century, as it was often called by traditional Marxists in the Prolekult, that does not mean it was an expression of mere false consciousness. As we know from the internet meme mentioned above, there is truth in falsehood, and bourgeois art forms offer both an immanent and transcendental critique of capitalist society, even if they manifest themselves negatively. Notwithstanding the Second International Radicals' colossal political influence in the early 20th century, and after the failure of communism to spread internationally and the Stalinization of the Soviet Union, the ideology represented by the Prolekult, which later degenerated into socialist realism, has an ideological stranglehold on the left today. The new left of the 1960s, even if it expressed an ambivalent relationship to class-based politics, correlated with Bogdanov and the Prolekults through their interest in Gramsci's notion of counter-hegemonic culture. And Sebastien mentioned the idea of hegemony earlier, which we could get into. Even today, with any kind of revolutionary workers' movement completely out of the picture, artists sympathetic to the working class's downtrodden situation follow similar strategies to the Prolekult. They attempt to unilaterally formulate an incipient culture that breaks all ties with bourgeois culture. Social practice or relational aesthetics, which are two movements well known in the art world, have been the buzzwords that describe many art projects as purported training grounds for or prefigurative glimpses into what an ostensible free society would look like. But without a clear revolutionary agent or an internationalist vision in the left's purview, most of these projects have degenerated into sub-populist deeds. They romanticize a nebulous ideal of community togetherness and organic interactions which never really existed in the first place. To counter such ahistorical politics, there are still organizations and artists who doggedly hold fast to a working-class bound culture, but engage in these realms as if the last 70 to 80 years never occurred. Worse still, attempts are made to raise class consciousness by encouraging cadre and revolutionary parties to assimilate their lifestyle to neatly fit the attitudes and interests of common working people. An example of this are the tactics conducted by the US-based Progressive Labor Party in the 1960s and 1970s, which they still utilize today. Here, the attempt to assassinate the conditions that keep the working class in an inferior social position has unwittingly become character assassination itself. Making a virtue out of the working class' most stereotypical cultural attributes, the hunting jacket-wearing sports fanatic who rocks out to Bruce Springsteen during their Miller time, actually pigeonholes the working class to its lowest common denominator, stripping it of all seriousness. Such a take on the working class is a textbook example of Philistinism, and trivializes the latent potential contained in the tastes of working class people, which undoubtedly has potential for advancement. The problems with working class culture, and I put that in quotations, as it exists today is precisely in its inauthenticity. Its whole array is administered by the culture industry, otherwise known as bureaucrats who pull the strings in the box office, down to its most nuanced detail. To mimic the culture that attracts working people as a consciousness-raising tactic is to follow suit in its unconscious commodification, and hence its counter-revolutionary character. Working people are ultimately fed kitsch from above, and they only uncritically accept it because it is a form of entertainment that offers a temporary escape from their daily grind. In the 19th and 20th centuries, a lineage of artists attempted to self-consciously separate their practices from the pre-digested character of kitsch culture by making challenging and critical works, by pushing the boundaries of traditionally accepted artistic forms and content. They have become known as the avant-garde. They were the artists in the front line who sought to advance culture to its fullest potential, to live up to the past by transforming its limitations towards new, previously unforeseen aesthetic possibilities. Far from administering artistic developments, the avant-garde worked imminently by giving meaning to cultural productions of bourgeois society in a time of crisis. This methodology allows the artist to transcend the strictures of becoming a mouthpiece for a particular class. It exposes what bourgeois culture promised, even after the ruling class abandoned it, while still refusing the allure of kitsch's siren calls. The downside of the avant-garde is its marginalized status, its forced inaccessibility to the masses on an intellectual and experiential level. Advanced culture recoiled into itself as an act of self-preservation. Further, the practices of the avant-garde were dependent on a strong international class struggle, which is absent from the scene today. Hence, the word avant-garde is also absent, reduced to a simulacrum producing ersatz advanced culture. There has been a palpable regression in art and culture because of political regression. The quality of artistic tendencies depends on the quality of politics. If we are to make advanced culture more widely available and task it to live up to its vibrant past, art should not be made more easily digestible to working class people like baby food, but more socially useful. Artists should instead try making the best and most advanced work possible while politically supporting radical programs that educate working people, such as improving literacy or historical consciousness. The critics and artists' task is to uphold the interests of the working class, even if it cuts against the grain of how working class culture currently configures itself, which is administered from above. Taking these roles sometimes means turning one's back on popular opinion and not adapting to it. It also means dialectically realizing the best facets of bourgeois culture through the process of negation, not concocting an independent working class or counter-hegemonic culture. The only way out is through. In many ways, our time is most like the 1840s in that art and class are underdeveloped agents that did not yet fully realize their revolutionary potential. 1848 was a catalyzing moment for such a consciousness back then, as Marx and Engels articulated. The difference now from class struggle in the 1830s and 1840s, which gave Leopold I such anxiety, was in its maturing phase, and it was deepening proletarian consciousness. Today, our consciousness as proletarian subjects is shrinking in a scope with the threat of being lost forever. For art and class to be dangerous entities, for the ruling class again, much political and cultural work is needed to be done. But But we must first recognize how much the horizon has lowered before we even properly make these steps. The wish image of the meme shows that all is not lost because it still resides in our social imagination. Now we just need to translate this wish image into having a real material effect on reality.
So we have about a 10 to 15 minute discussion among our panelists. So does any of the panelists have questions for each other or comments that they would like to make to each other?
I mean, I could start if you two have nothing immediately on the tip of your tongue.
Go ahead.
So I thought Bruce's presentation was very interesting. There's a part where he talks, the main emphasis of his presentation seems to me that the working class makes itself as much as it's made, where he was talking about how it's a structural and an ideological problem. And I want to emphasize that point because working class, even though it's positioned within the material aspects of society, meaning that they produce value for the capitalist system, they nonetheless have to identify themselves as working people in order to coalesce into a unified class. Today that's something lacking, that people don't really identify as working class in the same way that they used to, as Sebastien noted, and they identify through various other means, such as their sex or sexual preference, if they're disabled or if they're able-bodied, things like that. I think that is an effect, that kind of identity politics is an effect of the weakening of the working class as an identity and understanding themselves as a material force in society. I think that it's a symptom of regression, not to say that these ideologies of identity politics are regressive, but the emphasis placed on them because of the failure of the working class is regressive, is due to regression, symptomatic of that. How to get around that, I'm not quite sure, because it's not like we could just rekindle a working class consciousness and replay it the same as the 19th and 20th centuries. It just can't work that way. But I am weary of prioritizing, which I don't think Sebastien was defending, but prioritizing identity politics over class-based politics, namely because identity is always a shifting and changing phenomenon, especially in bourgeois society. Before, people didn't really have the luxury of concocting their own identity. They were pretty much sanctioned to be who they were at birth. Now we mobilize how we think about ourselves and others. So identity is a very fluidly changing concept of ourselves and each other, and doesn't really stand still in a way that your relation in material production does as a working class world citizen. So I think that there should be a political emphasis on class-based politics because it actually has a material effect on social reality, meaning that if you strike and stop, it halts the production of value, then it throws the whole means of production into crisis. I'm not quite sure if identity politics could really have such a major impact as that. That does not mean that it's class versus identity, but I think that we should couch it more as that identity is a class issue. It's not the two versus each other. So that's combining the two. And then I just have one side remark relating to Sebastien's presentation, where I do disagree about the hegemony, although I don't quite think he was defending the counter-hegemony culture that Gramsci iterates, which I only said in passing in my paper, so I can understand how that could be a confusing notion if people aren't familiar with that idea. But and also that the way he was describing how art communicates and the way that art could relate to social movements, whether they be identity or class-based. I wasn't quite clear on the difference between art and propaganda in his eyes, so I want to press Sebastien on that and see if he sees a difference between art and propaganda, and if so, why is it important to mark those differences? And because I personally think that art is far different than propaganda and would not want to reduce it. Nonetheless, I still see propaganda extremely important in political movements. I hope that was clear.
Sebastien, you want to come back this way?
Sure. I guess all I really have to say, perhaps, is now responses to points brought up by Chris. I think that the rise of what's referred to today as identity politics, like I explained earlier, kind of as a result of the postmodern kind of explosion of the narratives and theories of revolution. I think identity politics are a response to other systemic and materialized forms of oppression like patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity, which were totally ignored by the class analysis. But likewise, the rise of the identity politics as a response to those other systemic forms of oppression. In parallel to that was also a revolt against the class movement, the working class leftist movement, because that movement ignored those other forms of oppression. And so I think what I was trying to articulate is that the previous social movements and revolutionary movements that organized around class as its single focus was faulty because it only took in that systemic point of oppression. And so identity politics responded to that. But likewise, there's a trend because there's a bit of a revulsion and distrust towards class analysis and the working class culture because of that snobbing of other issues. And so I think that there's a lot of trust building and reconnecting between these different silos of organizing to kind of understand where common ground exists and where moving forward happens by helping each other out in genuine solidarity. And also, I forget now why I wrote this, but the problem I think with the evolving of the class analysis or the class identification as a mode of identification, I think, like I said, is that it's shifted away from identifying around the exploitation and capitalist dynamics, and instead kind of reframed itself around liberal notions of personal success and income accumulation. In terms of direct question around what I see the difference between art and propaganda, I guess it would depend on how you define art and propaganda. To me, they can be one and the same. As I said, art, to me, the fundamental purpose of art is to communicate, and the fundamental purpose of propaganda is to communicate. So, therefore, I don't really see what necessarily the difference is. Where there could be potentially a difference is that here we're talking about art within a broad strategy of revolutionary organizing. And so if you're producing art within a political project, then necessarily part of that art, its mandate, is to communicate the ideas, the values of that project. And so, I guess that makes it propaganda. Which propaganda is to, propagate, agitate, other stuff.
And to educate.
Educate, yeah.
No, propaganda isn't the silly one-liner thing to be scared of that everyone shivers at now. There is a means to propaganda. That's important.
Yeah. It's like the word theory. We have to domesticate it and give it a little bit of fuzziness so that it will be not antagonistic to most people's daily lives. That's why I like this poster. You could detone this in the grand situationist fashion and say, artists beware. Mixing with all classes of society can be dangerous. And that's part of the blogosphere that we deal with today, that you can put something on Facebook and suddenly it can be detoned in grand old situationist style and diverted into a new set of discourses and meanings that maybe counter what you had anticipated. This is what happened with class. If you go to see a film that's in the theaters right now called Pride, it intersects with everything that we've been talking about, both on the theoretical and the practical level with respect to the struggle around identity politics and class politics. One didn't eclipse the other. One has just become a function of the other, contingent upon power struggles. And if we domesticate these notions of hegemony, the discourse itself, and say, okay, this is basically a power struggle that exists either internally between people on social media or between people on a panel between you audience members and us, that there is a shared common understanding but also a sense that we have to contest what the other has to offer, contest what the other believes in, contest what they have to say. A couple of years ago, well, longer than that, in one of my most cynical moments, conjectured that the art world itself was like a Ponzi scheme, that there were payers, players, and prayers, people who were praying for success, people who were paying for, through their education, through their paying of gallerists and so on, and people who were attempting to accumulate symbolic and real capital to the top. But at the top were the mega artists, famous artists, gallerists like Saatchi and Saatchi, and who were accumulating the real and symbolic capital that was being preferred and moving upwards for their aggregation at the top of the pyramid. Should they go to jail, like the other Ponzi schemers of late, who led to the downfall of the capitalist system in 2008? In my most sanguine moments, I think perhaps they should. But on another level, I think, and I've endorsed this in my teaching and my art practice for many years, and the contradictions that I live with on a daily basis, that education for criticism can be a way to secure an art practice that is indeed praxeological in the best sense, that it recognizes its role as an agent towards real social change. I think that is what we attempted to do back in the early 1980s when we formed the Artists Union. When we took Picasso and put Picasso on our T-shirt, Picasso was a unionist. Here's one of the most famous artists of the 20th century, who was a member of the Communist Party, who produced his work when he was producing his famous work, Guernica, and the Nazis came into his Paris studio and said, "Did you do this?" And he said, "No, you did this." Pushed that back in their face and said, you Nazis were responsible for supporting the reactionary forces in Spain and the war that is ongoing there at this present time, and and of course the Nazis had no answer to this. Hitler was an artist. He said, "Let artists be free." He also didn't, although he was against homosexuality, he thought homosexual artists should be given some freedom. And this is, there are 2 or 3 books on this if you want to read them. In my PhD thesis, I explored some of this territory around art as a vehicle for social emancipation, but how it can also be a vehicle for repression and subordination, partly because of the structures within which we exist. And Marx didn't think this. He thought that the work of craftsmen, artisans, and artists was unfettered labor, non-alienated labor. Artists did what they used their labor for pleasure. But of course, he didn't quantify the fact that some people like what artists produce and they want to challenge other people to the value of that work. And then artists realized that their labor had a value, and that value could be put into economic terms, social terms, but also had some philosophical coordinates which reinforced alterity, the kind of alterity that Sebastien evoked when he talked about the queer show that Robin Metcalfe produced, which again is, and I agree, is classed politics writ large. And in fact, there are a few propaganda posters up there that I recognize as powerful works of art and politics.
I have several points to add, if that's okay. And just in direct response, I would like to respond to Sebastien, the conversation that I provoked with him earlier, and what Bruce directly just said, is that I don't know if Marx considered the artist's work as unalienated labor. I think that he saw it as basically a petty bourgeois aspiration. The semblance of owning your own means of production process and being free to do whatever you want. Not much different than the petty bourgeois aspiration of a shop owner, just kind of making their own booths without being part of a whole large factory system. And really, if you were to wedge artists in socioeconomic terms, I think that you can call them petty bourgeois people. Like, their ideologies perfectly in line with it. But nonetheless, the Ponzi scheme of the whole art system that was just referred to is reflective of the capitalist system. It's, there's a reason why the ruling class were, their heads were chopped off in 1789 and stuff like that, because they were the direct oppressors of everyone else. The tricky thing about capitalists now is Marx called them the character masks of capital. And, we could maybe have if we do ever have some kind of revolution, I would not necessarily object to beheading some ruling class figures, but I don't think that would necessarily be addressing the source of the problem. The real source of the problem is the domination of capital over the way in which we produce and reproduce life, and that also ultimately structures a class system. What we need to do is really address this abstract dominating social system that, in a way, dominates the bourgeoisie, because they're beholden to maintaining the always constant need for surplus value. Not to say that the bourgeoisie should be off scot-free, but they nonetheless are the character masks in perpetuating an alienated social condition that always needs to constantly produce and reproduce surplus value, and then that systematically creates classes. I had one other point, about the petty bourgeois character. I did emphasize in my paper, though, that the artists were, in effect, an unassimilated class. And that could be a contradiction to my claim that artists are couched as petty bourgeois producers in socioeconomic terms. And the reason I think that artists, in a way, should be understood as the unassimilated class, or the déclassé, is because what they do transcends their own production in society. Maybe this is why they appear as unalienated laborers, because when we look at art and behold the experience that could be much more than what that could offer us glimpses into a kind of utopian reality, or allow us to see more clearly how society is increasingly dominating us, then that really transcends what the artist was trying to do in socioeconomic terms, meaning own their little studio, sell their work in order to make a living. In response to Sebastien about class versus identity as a means for fighting the exploitation and social domination, I don't think the way he was framing it as different modes of oppression. The working class was never the most oppressed people. In fact, they did pretty well compared to the paupers and the peasantry, who had really dismal conditions. They were probably the most oppressed in Marx's time. Marx was trying to make a political point in saying that given this working class status in the mode of production, meaning that they were the wage laborers and they had enough subsistence to live, and they were also grouped in mass in factories and could organize together, they were the better agents to look for social change because of their position in the production process, not because they were most oppressed. And I think that conflates a few things to try to base your politics on which groups are most oppressed. It doesn't mean that you should have tremendous amount of empathy and sympathy for those who are the most downtrodden of all in society, whether it be the Palestinians or the sweatshop workers in Cambodia. I mean, we want to get them out of that situation as soon as possible, but politically, it might be valuable to look towards the working class as the agents to make that happen quicker, better, and stronger. I have a lot of other things to say, but I'll shut up.
I think Bruce just shook his head there.
Well, if we look at working class movements and political organizations like the NDP in Canada, they've been without power. When they get power, as we witnessed recently here in Nova Scotia, they're constrained by the organizations that determine how they're going to act in the theater of politics. And often they become very conservative in their approaches to what they may have inherited as conventional working class projects, like the emancipation of working people and the equalization of remuneration for for labor expended, to tax the corporations and so on and so forth in order to secure social welfare opportunities. And of course, what happened? They were elected in, landslide elected out in 3 years because they didn't fulfill their objectives as a party of the working classes. We tend to reify class. I think this is where Foucault, I betray a kind of Foucauldianism, that we should, I know you don't like postmodernism, but one thing about postmodernists is that they always go like this. You can recognize a postmodernist because they go like that, or they pluralize things. So I always, classes, political identity, political identities, arts, artists, suddenly you have a different perspective of the discourse that controls your engagement with. I find this in my classes. I say, okay, well, what do you actually mean by that class? And because it's, as Raymond Williams pointed out, like culture, one of the most difficult words in the English language. Because different people have a different understanding of it, just as the Welsh miners in Pride who said, oh, the LGBT group in London can't support us. They can't provide us with money because we don't recognize, we're basically a homophobic organization. They didn't say that. Sorry, guys, girls, sorry, you trans people, we don't recognize you because we're homophobic miners. We're part of the masculine tradition of working class mining culture, and here are our banners. And yet they were won over in the time of Thatcher's assault on the mines, in those crucial years where mining became an insignificant. In fact, she broke the working class, and she was from a working class background. Well, a shopkeeper's class, upwardly mobile working class background, and she broke her conventions. The conventions of, attachment to her class background and class consciousness, as we know from Stuart Hall, infects us all. And so, again, I would say I can be very positive. When I published a book called Literal Art and Communicative Action, I thought the front line of agency now is represented around climate change, and the working class struggle had been usurped by the environmental movement. I still feel that to be somewhat the case. I wish it wasn't, but if it's not, then I like what truthout.org does. It comes into my inbox every day, asks me to sign a petition for this or that, that movement, or that individual, or that seal, or that white bear, and I feel powerless, but I sign those petitions. I try and support the local environment movements, ecology action, and so on, by sending them money. I support other organizations by sending money. I solve my middle-class guilt by sending money out when and where I can. And but I think that my guilt has a historical trajectory to it, that my working class affiliations are still intact because of my upbringing, and because I've seen a lot of good work produced by artists who identify with working class political projects, including Carl and Carol, who have been friends of mine for like 40 years, and artists around the world, curators who identify not only with one emancipatory project, but a dozen, and work on many, many different fronts, both in the education institutions and outside as well.
Can the screensaver be turned off? It's really distracting.
Yeah, sure. Here,
So, thank you for your patience. Our Q&A will
start and begin. And so if you have any questions, we will start from the left, I guess, just similar leftist group. No, I'm joking. So if there's any questions or comments from the audience, if you can keep it succinctly under 3 sentences or 3 sentences at maximum, so that everyone may have an opportunity to talk and so that the panelists can answer your questions. So if you have any questions, that is. If you have questions, raise your hands up now. So we can. Oh, okay. So we're starting from the left and we'll move towards the right.
Can I ask, compare it down to 3 sentences?
Right.
Can I ask early, just compare it down?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I guess you can start first then, and then I'll go back to him.
No, go ahead.
Oh, he's trying
I want
to.
to pare it down. So
He wants to condense his question.
Oh,
So.
okay. I don't know if I'm going to be able to bear it down, but I'll do my best. I'm a little bit overwhelmed, and I mean absolutely no disrespect. I think an intellectual discourse is really important. I prefer calling it talking, but I think it's important. I had a tremendous amount of difficulty understanding your presentation and yours, and I'm with the educated bourgeoisie, so I don't know what that's about. But I wanted to make a couple of comments. I did feel that some of the statements that you made, sir, essentially dismissed 40 years of struggle, as if there has been no left-wing struggle since the 60s. And I think to dismiss out of hand as a weakened working class all of the work and successes that have been achieved by the civil rights movement, the white women's movement, the Aboriginal movement, and the list is endless. And to suggest that those are not working class successes, I find painful. And I didn't fall off the back of a turnip truck. I mean, I understand that these are not conventionally understood to be working class struggles that are grounded in a Marxist understanding of class and a Marxist understanding of the proletariat. But I think what I found eloquent about what Seb put forward is that all of these struggles for liberation, though they have not achieved liberation, have achieved some conditions by which now the working class may in fact possibly become united. So I felt hurt by that. I don't mean that like in a big fat emotional way.
I think I understand.
That, as a 66-year-old woman with many other people of my generations who fought on those fronts, I'm insulted by the idea that that is not working class progress. It is not revolution, I agree with you, but neither were the other struggles in that they were not completed revolutionary struggles. The last thing I wanted to say, which I know it is in 2 sentences, is that I'm a little concerned that I thought that the representations of art being discussed did not distinguish, or at least I didn't understand where they distinguished between visual art, uniform, music, food, housing, and all of the different ways that people represent themselves artistically. So I'm a little confused about whether the discussion was strictly about artists or working class expressions of art, which I think are different questions. So if anybody experienced the struggles in the 1980s between the use of popular music in the African American and queer communities as instruments of resistance and rebellion, it was incredible. So it wasn't invisible, and it was represented not by individuals who named themselves artists, but by expressions of collective behavior in many working class communities.
I'll let you respond if you feel so inclined.
Okay. The 1960s and after, I think, amount to a catastrophic failure for left. That it resonated with you of being of that generation, I think it's a good thing. I think the bad thing, which I potentially presented poorly, was that it came off as dismissive. The way I define the left and the way I defined freedom is freedom for every individual on the globe. I personally think that the struggles up to about 1923 were probably the only potentially viable solutions to that kind of politics, making that happen. And obviously it went awry and it wasn't without its problems, spawned into Stalinism and fascism, respectively. So it's not like I hold the 19th and early 20th century on a high platter, but I think that the consequences that suffered from the workers' movements early on are a kind of good barometer to see how serious they were in affecting the global politics of that time. The 1960s, de Gaulle was, France almost collapsed. Latin America had a lot going on. It's not like it was a trivial time. But you might also remember the Port Huron statement from 1960, where your generation was quite pissed off at their prior generation and their parents. It's some very damning critiques of the older generation that I'm sure left them with pangs of pain. But I think that there really hasn't been progress in an emancipatory sense since the early 19th, or I'm sorry, the late 19th, early 20th century. A lot of reforms, great reforms have happened, and it has been the greater unfolding of greater bourgeois freedoms in many ways, which I would totally support. I don't look down upon reformism. I think that reforms are good as long as they help them out towards revolutionary goals. But I do think that there was a decline in actual substantial reformist fights for revolution in the 1960s, and I think it was embodied in a lot of the New Left rhetoric and ideas about class, agents of change.
Just to be clear, I wasn't at all referring to the New Left or the Huron statement or that or the
like working class movements.
I was talking about all of the working class movements since, not then, since that period that reflect the struggles of women, the civil rights movement, the queer movement, international movements all over the world. That's what I'm referring to. I'm not referring to the Huron statement guys, who were in fact a reproduction in new clothing of the political entrapment that constituted the previous 60 years of interpretation of Karl Marx. So that's, I don't want to get into the debate, I'm just saying I'm not talking about the boys at Port Huron, for whom many of those other movements constituted a rebellion against that conceptualization of struggle.
I'll try to summarize my view very quickly, and then we could move on so I don't have a stranglehold on the conversation. But I don't think that a lot of the figures, like the leaders, writers of that time, had bad ideas. I think there was a lot of interesting ideas. It was necessary to critique the old left coming from them. Women's liberation movement, segregation, problems of segregation, racism, all were very eloquently addressed by a lot of figures, and there were points where the leaders of that movement actually changed discussions and allowed people like women to vote. Black people, segregation ended in the United States in many ways. But what happened with those movements, and it's not necessarily the leaders' faults at that time, is that a lot of those identity-based issues have become subsumed into interest-based politics. So then women issues just become about women issues, or racist issues just become about racist issues. So it expresses the fighting from a particular group for that particular group, and it doesn't quite really speak to the broad masses. The working class workers' movements, in fact, had that problem, as Sebastien pointed out very well, where it just became about workers, and then it did segregated between black and white, or women and men, stuff like that. But I think that the working class movements in the early 20th century, late 19th century, were much better at being all-encompassing and inclusive in ways that degenerated in the 1930s through the 1960s, which saw a new life, but then again degenerated up to today. And I'm not looking at it as it's a problem with their ideas, or it's a problem with what they were trying to do. It's more of looking at material reality today. Workers' movements have deflated. Union membership has declined. Women there's still a lot of sexist elements in society. Black people, although women allowed to vote, black people less segregated. Racism is rampant, as we saw in Ferguson, even if we have a black president. And I think that the only way to truly try to overcome those is try to reinvigorate the workers' movement that can address those issues in ways that a lot of the interest groups kind of end up confining what their politics are based on. Even the LGBT movement, to a degree, has that problem, I think.
There's a lot of internal conflict with LGBTQ.
It's not like it's all, it's not representative of everyone or every idea, but it hasn't. The problem with left politics now is universal. These movements have ended up just becoming separate movements, and they stay that way. There hasn't been some kind of force that coalesces them all together in a unifying global struggle to overcome capital. And that's what I'm interested in, and that's what I find emancipatory. And if that's not happening, then I think that signifies a kind of decline in our political struggles and our political consciousness. And what I'm trying to figure out is why that is. And I'm looking to these bits. But I don't think, per se, each individual or each of these groups are responsible for the whole problem. I see it as a universal problem amongst all of them. I hope that makes some sense, but I'll stop there.
So moving on to Brad's question.
Yeah, it seemed to me that at a couple points you all touched on something about the working class that I felt didn't get fleshed out. Like, what is the working class, and is it homogeneous? And obviously it's not. We know that, Bruce Springsteen listening, Miller Lite, whatever, is not the working class. So you mentioned, Bruce, that classes are as much, they make themselves, that are about ideology as well as structure. And then Sebastien, you were like, well, there are all these people who call themselves middle class, but moving on. That seems to me to really skim over. I think that you have to maybe grapple with the fact that this middle class, doing the homo thing, really maybe has created. I would prefer to follow J.C. Kai and describe it as a labor aristocracy. And you come around to something like the Queer Art Show, which is really interesting because it's happening at the Khyber, which is a space that used to be a black-owned dance studio in a gentrifying neighborhood, curated by a white gay man. And we get this whole thing where what we see is this sort of the integration of large parts which we might have previously identified as working class into this part of the working class that sees itself as middle class, and it seems to its production of art, as in the case of the Khyber, seems to be fundamentally destructive to working class solidarity. If we see the working class as fundamentally constituted by things like race, it's hard to square running up I'm not blaming the Khyber, to be clear. It's gentrification is a thing that happens. It's not they were we are going to evict, evict, shake, and dance, move into their space. That didn't happen. But as these sort of structural forces, that is what happened. And how do we square those things? What does working class artists mean? Who are working class artists? And is there a working class artist project that is connected to something bigger than working class people making art? I don't know. There's a bunch there.
See, if you lived in England, you would know who the working class artists are because the way they speak would identify which socioeconomic space they were from. But when they go through art schools, they adopt the manners and the actions, and their work is subsumed under a different kind of set of principles. Let's call them ideological ciphers. That then and there is indeed a lot of false consciousness among people who have been subordinated for not 1 year but for generations through their families, where they have to identify with their class in order to survive. But when they find that they're not accepted into the Royal College when they apply, which is an old boys institution with indeed a few strong feminists teaching there as well, that they have capacity through their accumulation of symbolic capital to become upwardly mobile. And when they win the Turner Prize, or when they are bought by Saatchi and Saatchi, suddenly they're catapulted into a celebrity class where their work can command huge values. It loses its emancipatory potential simply because it's become an extraordinary commodity. They lose their agency as working class artists because they've been co-opted by a more powerful structure which represents, the capitalist empire and government that controls Great Britain. I agree with you. I lived through the 60s too. I was a hippie, and I felt disenfranchised in the 80s when suddenly, the hippies and yippies had been absorbed into, the dominant cultural dominant, and suddenly Vogue magazine was making money off all of the ersatz fashion productions. That's why I showed those pearly kings and queens, because they represent the best. And from my perspective, also the troublesome aspects of working class culture. How they attempt to become philanthropists through their agency, but also they deny their working class origins through their actions and through their identifications with with royalty. They are the other royalty. Of course, the punks also did the same thing. Borrowing from the Dadaists, as Lipstick Traces tells us, borrowing from the Dadaists and the Situationists to improve their work, their strategies. So I'm sorry she's left. Is she? Okay.
You have anything to say, Sebastien?
Well, just in response, I guess, to Brad's latest comment about defining a working class. That's part of the struggle, right? And that's why, part of what I see as a strategic goal for revolutionary artists or revolutionary organizers altogether is to tackle those subjective questions of identity and negotiating what are particular and universal interests to any form of identification to a social grouping. In terms of working class, I got the impression that you distinguished working class from middle class. I don't necessarily make that distinction because I feel that they're defined along different lines. As I said, I think working class. And I think that it's a form of identity that we should kind of reclaim and reestablish as a base for a social movement, as one of many bases for a social movement. I think should be like the distinction, like the boundaries of working class identity should be along the lines of who owns and controls the materials and places that we need to actually produce things. And so a working class person is being paid, puts in labor, and uses the means of production owned and controlled by someone else, as opposed to kind of an income level. Now, funny thing is, as a union organizer, given an example of organizing in coffee shops, where primarily young workers in indie cafes anyway kind of work, most of them coming from backgrounds that they would identify as middle class. And they would probably identify as middle class and not working class for the most part, I would imagine. And yet, they don't make any more, they don't have any more benefits or any advantages in their working conditions over the janitors that I also organize. And in that case, in that demographic, would probably more likely identify as working class. But even then, not necessarily, because there's such a stigma about working class meaning being poor. And so even if people may objectively, using that kind of definition, be of a working class category, would not identify as such because that has some bad stigma around it, and middle class implies that you're doing better off than working class.
One of the things we have to live with, I think, as a working class born subject myself, I know how oppressive the working class can actually be, but I also know how it has an emancipatory potential within it that has a power to move people, to engage with people on many different fronts, whether it be the emancipation of women, the emancipation of people of color, the emancipation of colonized subjects, and the emancipation of children. And I think that the history of unionization, which is outlined in one of the books that I mentioned, is all about that, the progressive values of the working class, even given its potential to oppress its very subjects. This is one of the extraordinary contradictions that the New Left struggled with for 50 years. Through the New Left Review, you could read every month the angst-ridden struggles that intellectuals had with what is it to have a working class identification? What is it to have a working class culture when you know that your whole family is homophobic, or your whole family hates blacks, or your whole family only goes to soccer games and drinks beer and sings working class songs. This is, and of course that movie Pride shows this writ large. I wish we'd had that film rather than, this film. But, you can't have everything. And it's quite revelatory to think that, when I was in Poland before Lech Walesa and the change to Polish society that was wrought by the working man's struggle at Gdansk shipyards, they wanted little capitalist, entrepreneurial groups to start up and set up in the square where the palace that Stalin had given them. They wanted democracy. They didn't know that when they opened the doors to Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola, that their whole own indigenous bottling and fruit preserving organization and fruit juice producing companies was going to disappear. In fact, I did a piece about that, but that's neither here nor there. When the wall came down in Berlin, a lot of people on the left, including myself, including Benjamin Buchloh, a German who was here, said, "Oh, that's it. That's the end. That's, it's gone." The whole ideal of the emancipation of Europe and the socialization, because he, like many of us, thought that communism was just a path towards social democracy of the best kind. That communism was going to lead to the true emancipation of everybody, not just workers, but everyone, including, and sorry, Chris, I don't think we thought we had to lop people's heads off in order to secure that, although I know where you're coming from. Because we've seen in the media ISIS lopping people's heads off, and not too many of us think that's an emancipatory, revolutionary act performed by people who have been disenfranchised and want their own caliphate. And of course we could argue endlessly about this, and I'm not the first person to say that I abhor that, but I also don't understand it.
Did that somewhat answer your question? It was a little bit diverted, but...
My question was kind of like, I wanted to hear about some themes and that.
Okay, that's great.
Sorry for not formulating a clearer question, and I appreciate both of your...
Sorry, I'm talking too much. I'm going to shut up.
No. Okay, so you had a question, was it?
Well, I think I've just recently on a new question, so if you want to go that way, then
Okay,
come back.
sure. I think it was Gabe first.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about how the internet has now affected the way that the working class and art interacts with each other, and what effect is that having? Is it disseminating it better? Is it covering up class differences? Is it fragmenting our consciousness?
Atomizing, one word, I think.
How come?
Because it makes us all individual agents rather than members of groups. If you can have your 15 minutes of fame through social networks, then you'll go for that. The binding character of working class culture has been evacuated, I believe, because the original signifiers that said, okay, you're a member of the working class because you were born in this area, because you have this income, you have these jobs, you drink this beer, and you like this music. It doesn't work anymore. Those indices, those indicators, just don't do it anymore. That's why you have to make yourself working class in order to identify with the working class. If you believe that there is a working class project there, then you have to identify with it in order to give it some agency. That's what I think.
If I may, I would caution against confusing cause from effect in that I don't think it's the internet that causes atomization. I think that it's the social conditions that cause atomization, and the way in which people utilize the internet is an expression of that. I think that we can't really look at it through a technological determinist lens, as if the invention of a new technology is the root cause of how we engage socially. I think that the internet has certainly helped catalyze and expedite that, but there was a collective desire to already be connected, express yourself at your fingertips, communicate, with the the wave of a hand, like a magician. That was already there, and the internet allowed that possibility to manifest. I think that the internet could highly enhance culture, highly enhance organizing. If you see like the Arab Spring movements, thousands and thousands of people turned up to these events because through Facebook announcements, and people who may have not been part of these movements would come out because through their social networks they were able to get access to the information. But on the other hand, I've read an interesting article, the author of the name I can't remember right now, who talked about how movements based on internet culture are actually problematic because of that atomization that Bruce was speaking of. And then they were contrasting it to civil rights movements where people were actually working really hard developing interpersonal relationships with the people they were organizing with, such as SNCC, DSMCC, if you guys... I'm more familiar with American movements, so pardon my foreignness. But they in the 50s, that would eventually consolidate into the civil rights movements, they would all go out to the south for the summer and do these really intensive camps, like organizing camps. And through those networks of solidifying interpersonal relationships, they were able to have more trust in each other and hence have a much stronger movement. In terms of culture, I do think the internet... I'm sorry if I'm taking too long. The internet has changed culture dramatically in some ways. But I think it's very much the same question as photography and cinema that a lot of thinkers were talking about in the early 20th century. Like, what does it mean that we could reproduce an image in an infinite amount of times? And now all of a sudden it's not like just one singular artwork that people, only a small group could see, but could be reproduced en masse and allow the masses to see. Well, the internet, I think, just begs those questions in the same way. And it has changed the way artists produce, and there's some interesting artists working with that notion, the difference between the physical object versus documentation, and people making art directly on the internet. But
I'm just going to give Sebastien a chance to...
Yeah, that doesn't quite relate to working class culture.
Yeah.
I think the internet, facilitates communication to a certain extent, but only communication of, political projects and organizing that is actually grounded in the communities. I mean, for the Arab Springs, just like the Quebec strikes, people didn't turn up because they saw Facebook and Twitter announcements of where to show up. They showed up because they knew, they'd been told by people they knew that something was happening. I could post shit on Twitter and Facebook and nobody's going to... In fact, a lot of people try and do that. There's stuff like that happening here in Halifax that really annoys me. Mm-hmm. People create a Facebook event, show up, protest this, and then maybe a few people show up, but that's not organizing, right? I mean...
There's actually, if I can interject too, more literature now on the Arab Spring. Not so much Arab Spring, but the Green Uprising in Iran and how the whole social media aspect was really overplayed by the West. And that it was not a big part of what really got people out on the streets, that it was overestimated and the numbers were way off. So it spoke to more traditional ways of getting people together to what actually happened in those places. Definitely in Iran. I don't know so much about the Arab Spring, I haven't really been studying it, but there's been some counter-arguments to that whole...
Yeah. And to take a recent event, like, for example, you mentioned Ferguson, what happened in Ferguson, the internet, like other media, allowed for education and awareness about what was happening in Ferguson, and allowed for similar, solidarity protests to emerge in other parts of the continent and the world. But that's not due simply to the fact that people saw images of what was going on in Ferguson that they hit the streets. It's because they had communities of people who were already thinking and talking about these issues, and when they saw what was going on in Ferguson, called each other up and actually talked in person about it. And then, of course, other people kind of hearing about it might join in, but the bulk of the people showing up at events like this is because they're actually part of a community of people.
Yep. I'm going to go on to the second last question, and then I'm sorry if it's taking too long. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Sebastien, I think that how you refer the working class, a class mainly concerned with survival in their traditional. I think that I think that to say that the struggle of the working class is simply completely correlates, and particularly the working class today, that it correlates directly to the struggle of women and the LGBT community, and I think that disregards the very strong traditionalist element within the working class, whereas survival and the traditional gender roles in the church and procreation are seen as essential to their identity as a sort of a surrogate wealth and a humility before God, and also the other feminist traditions such as the radical lesbian feminists who think that that trans women are simply men who have been surgically altered, or the Afrocentric blacks who think that homosexuality itself is something caused by a product of European decadence.
Right. So, what's your question?
How do you tell them that your identity, that what you base your life in the working class identity upon, is invalid because it does not serve the interest of the feminists and the LGBT and the.
Well, I'm still not exactly sure what you're asking, but I think you're suggesting that because I position working class in opposition to, or that you think that I position working class in opposition to like a feminist identity or LGBTQ identity.
Said that it can simply be, and that their identity has to be integrated with the concerns, and that if their identity does not fit that, they must change it.
Well, no, I mean...
Are you asking whether or why he's thinking the working class movement should be more inclusive?
No, I'm asking how does he address that element within the working class who sees that identity as essential to the working class identity?
Okay, so, well, I mean, that kind of speaks to, like Bruce was talking about the film Pride is a perfect example of that, right? I mean, being oppressed doesn't mean you're a good person. It just means you're oppressed, right? So you can build solidarity by recognizing that oppression and fighting shoulder to shoulder with people to confront those forms of oppression, and through that you build relationships of trust and dialogue so that you can start identifying that your fight is my fight and my fight is your fight, and that's how you build solidarity. You can't just I hear about a group of, for example, African Nova Scotian, combating an issue of racism in their workplace. They happen to, use rhetoric that's really homophobic. I can't just say, well, F that, I'm not going to, bother with that. I have to engage. No struggle is going to be perfect. Organizing is really messy, difficult business, and we have to be prepared to confront those difficult questions and to negotiate those tensions, and because that's the only way that we're going to actually build solidarity.
I mean, that's where the place of politics is that there's splits and oppositions in politics as much as there is integration in politics. And it seems to make sense that if you are primarily see yourself as a working class, like a union organizer focused mainly on working class issues, but want to include people who are focused solely or mainly on like LGBT issues, you try to incorporate the ones that you think have a more leftist vision, and then if there's some reactionary identity politics that you said, oh, what about these people, then you be decisive and you say, well, we will not allow these kinds of ideologies as part of our movement. So as much as you want to include, you also want to create certain political splits in order to make those differences more acute. Try to point out what could be potentially more emancipatory versus what could be reactionary.
I don't agree.
I mean, I am all for left unity, but with certain basis. Like, I think it's important to make certain segregations too. I think that's the game of politics.
I mean, to me, if the issue affects a particular group of people, you don't necessarily have the choice of saying, well, those people aren't leftist enough, so I'm going to wait till another group that's more leftist faces the same situation and help them. No, I'm going to engage with these people, and part of my responsibility will be to retain, obviously, an autonomy of my own analysis and negotiate myself truthful compromises in terms of what kind of help I can assist. But in that process of dialogue, I attempt to open spaces where we can talk about what are common fights and where we can build ground for solidarity.
Perhaps it's an issue of language, because I don't agree there. I think it's just a matter of making political divisions and drawing certain political lines. It doesn't necessarily mean that people who are oppressed, as you said, are good people or may share your same politics. And I think there's a point where you have to say I am fighting to open up greater freedoms for you and your group, or all people in general, but I do not think you embody the proper politics to make that realizable. That's basically what I'm trying to say.
I'm just going to move on to our last question so that everybody can go.
How much time do we have?
I'll give you another 5 to 7 minutes, and I think we'll close up.
This is off track, so I don't know if it's really useful, but I want to get back to the idea of revolutionary art, it's a very easy question. I just wanted to know if you could each talk a little bit briefly about a contemporary work of art that you have seen. Let's avoid Pride, because although I haven't seen it, I've heard a lot about it, but I'd love to hear something, maybe perhaps something that's been created by a local, or I guess you're not from here, but something you've seen, locally, that speaks to revolution, or that could embody what Sebastien was talking about earlier when we were talking about artists as workers too, anyway, just some example, if you could, and also art as a vehicle for letting the viewer or the audience experience something in a new way, and therefore, promoting a revolutionary spirit. Would you take a shot at that?
Well, that's a wonderful question. It fills me with awe, and I'm not sure whether I can point to a single work. But again, this sounds very egocentric, but I wrote a book recently about, and on the literal art and communicative action, and on the cover is some work by an Israeli artist who's been working since the 70s to bring together Palestinian and Jewish kids on environmental projects in a special structure that is solar powered and built with the labor of members of this community, students, and people that support his family's work. That's ongoing, and it's making a small, I would say, small R revolutionary change. On the cover of my book, a Palestinian and Jewish kids skipping in a space that is normally reserved for thinking of divisions between communities and between. So there are some people, and I don't know if you've seen that joint Israeli-Palestinian film called Lemon Tree, which is very much about, that's another work that I think has revolutionary potential, or is actually revolutionary with respect to Palestinian-Israeli politics.
It's a co-production, you mean?
Yeah. Is it changing anything? The recent events, which were sparked by the murder of Palestinian and Israeli youths, seem to indicate otherwise. However, I think it's a spark, and often a spark. Often revolutions are started not by working class people, but members of a revolutionary elite, intellectuals, like Marx and Engels, for example, like Trotsky, for example, that they identified with the working class emancipation and the projects around the emancipation of the peasants in Russia. And there were artists like Meyerhold, Mayakovsky, Prolekult, Lunacharsky, the people that recognized that art had some revolutionary use value. Another work that I discuss at length in an essay in my book is by a group of artists who are based in Vienna called Wochenclosure, which means in English, weeks of enclosure. This is a group of artists who collaborate with social scientists, architects, others who are invested in the work they do. And they've done work around homelessness after the war in former Yugoslavia for Kosovoan children, and they set up education camps. They've done work on prostitution and drug use in Zurich, and I don't know whether you know it, but they used to send youths over to dry out in Nova Scotia. I could go on at length, but there are two examples of work that I find has a strong working class character and revolutionary potential on a small but very active scale.
I'm just going to get Sebastien to answer that question.
What comes to mind when asking, what is an example of art that would fit, that criteria that is revolutionary? What comes to mind are a couple of quotes and sayings. First of which is that all art is political in the sense that it serves someone's politics. And that's a quote by an American playwright whose name I don't remember at the moment. So all art is political in the sense that it serves someone's politics. And that connects me to another saying, which is, it's not his exact saying, but I'm paraphrasing, but that the act of designating something as apolitical is the ultimate political act.
George Orwell.
Okay. So, and that leads me to a quote by Howard Zinn, who said, "You can't be neutral on a moving train." So all that to say that, and I can use the example, I guess, of the arts festival that I help organize, which is the Mayworks Halifax Festival, that when I look for works of arts to program, I look for art that, that goes against the direction of a train, basically, of one of those trains that is the status quo of our society. And so, so those are kind of things that come to mind in terms of my criteria of finding revolutionary art, is finding art that challenges or subverts popular trends that inherently support exploitative or oppressive systemic problems in our society. As a concrete example, I don't know if there's anything locally that I can say really blew my mind in that regard. There are certain things that I really like that I've been proud of programming at Mayworks. One of the things, like Emily Davidson's art show that she did at the Khyber building in Barrington, where she wallpapered all the walls with images of this was very working class in the sense that it was struggles in industrial sectors, but depicting all women's struggles, and Lucy Parsons, a woman of color as well. But that was really awesome. A personal experience. It's not exactly local, but as you know, I've apprenticed at Bread and Puppet Theatre in Vermont, and that was an awe-inspiring kind of experience for me to be there and experience the way, not only the art that they produce, but the way that they produce it, and the aesthetic that Peter Schumann uses, who's the artistic director of the company, that is both very populist and accessible and broad-based, but also in certain cases very experimental and influenced by German expressionism and stuff like that. So yeah, that's an example of something that I appreciate a lot. And also one of the things that really marked me at my time there was when Bread and Puppet has been accused at times, and Peter Schumann had addressed this, well, don't you think that the art that you're doing, don't you think you're just preaching to the choir by being so political that you're only talking to people that would appreciate those politics? And his response to that was that the choir needs preaching to. Because to go back to what Bruce was saying earlier, that the working class, like any kind of revolutionary identification, is not just made; it's self-produced as well, and we need to recognize ourselves somewhere, because it's very discouraging otherwise in this era where it's very easy to feel alone and isolated. So to have someone preach at you, this can be really reinvigorating in that sense.
So can I ask a quick side question to that, to what you said, not about PhD, but before that, would you consider, as a curator of a working class or whatever keywords this was, would you consider programming something that necessarily didn't, whose subject matter didn't overtly address the struggles of working class, but in the way in which it was created, which may not be evident to the viewer? Would you consider programming that because it was counter, like it went against the movie training kind of thing?
Do you mean? I'm not sure if I understand.
Like if a typical way of making a theater show is a 3-week rehearsal process with a script in your hand, blah 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 blah,
right,
then would you consider programming something that was, made collectively over a period of 3 years, even though the subject matter has nothing to do with working class or workers?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, kind of like I said before, when we programmed that work that addressed mental illness, really didn't talk about work very much at all, or class. But I think that's an issue that a lot of working people are concerned about or affected by directly, or should be made aware of. But certainly, the creative process is also something that, I would consider. And that's why we've worked at Mayworks to build partnerships with arts organization in the city here who are artist-owned or follow a cooperative model, things like that. So that's certainly part of, I think the actual practice and creation of art, the actual labor of it, is also how that's made. I think is also an important consideration to me. Yeah.
I'll just morph this into my final remarks too. I do have an artist in mind, but I'll say it with a caveat first, which is that I don't think that it is art's goal to try to communicate certain revolutionary ideals. I think it's really a matter of working through its own inner laws, through its form material problems. Like some of the most radical artists during the Russian Revolution were like the constructivists and the supremacists. And if you look at the work, there's no content whatsoever that speaks towards revolutionary aspirations. It was actually this really fascinating merging of visual design and geometric abstraction that created beautiful pictorial images that had never really been seen before. You could make historical examples, but they were qualitatively new productions of art. And just through working through the inner laws of the material that they were trying to work with, they were able to make something that no one has really seen or experienced before. And I think that's far more revolutionary than trying to stamp revolutionary aspirations to stamp the content of revolutionary aspirations and treating art as a vessel to communicate something. I think that form and formal problems need to be considered. But that's still not to say that thematic, art that deals with thematic issues of politics or revolution, will not mean it's bad art. It's a matter of how it's executed. So I think that for art to be most revolutionary is to claim its own autonomy from political struggles, in a sense. A lot of the mid-20th century artwork that was really minimal, like Jackson Pollock. There was a critic, Clement Greenberg, that's really famous for bolstering Pollock as one of the best painters of the time, and he wrote this really famous essay too in 1939 called Avant-Garde and Kitsch, and he was talking about how is it that certain states and regimes appropriate art of our times to bolster their own efforts in gaining power. And he said, funny enough, the art that's most abstract and communicates the least, most of those regimes don't touch, and they actually perceive it as the most dangerous because it doesn't allow for as much easy appropriation in their own political goals. That goes for communist as well as fascist regimes. Now, the artist I have in mind, which I'll finish with, is, to be provocative, is a 2008 Turner Prize winner named Mark Leakey. And he did this wonderful two videos. This is like a Depict videos called Green Screen Refrigerator. And it's basically a video of a black refrigerator propped in front of a green screen. So it looks like this monolith, and it starts talking. There's this really eerie sound to it, and it's talking to the audience about the components of the refrigerator as well as how it works but the way it's poetically written is that it sounds like it's this authoritarian force over you, and it's gripping you. And the green screen turns into all these wild images in the background of produce and stuff. Of like sometimes it's produce rotting, and other images like really wild. I think it's all culled from the internet too, actually. But it's this really insane experience watching it, and I think it really makes the kind of domination that you feel in society palpable. I think in our age, art that's most successfully revolutionary is art that makes palpable and felt our own freedom in our current juncture. So I'll just end that. Not that toots a trumpet for revolutionary fervor or something.
Okay. So before we conclude for the evening, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'm so sorry it was so long. But I felt like there were some really strong points that were pointed out there. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors and Bruce Barber for booking this room, NSCAD University, Dalhousie Student Union Sustainability Office, and Carbon Arc for making this possible. So again, if you're interested in more events and if you haven't signed up for our mailing list, pick up a copy of the Platypus Review at the information table and have a good night. We're probably heading out for drinks afterwards as well. We might head to Stillwell or to Split Crow, so you're more than welcome to join us.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Josh.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I can't join you for a drink.
Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really appreciate your comments and